just to start, I'll just talk about what I've been doing just to go into it. So one thing I've been is down to a marginal today, where there's lots of those. These are crucial to the campaign to get Labour in, if that's what's wanted, to get Jeremy Corbyn the chance of any possible majority, because you've got locally here, where you're listening, you've got Frodsham, which is in the Weaver Vale constituency. That has Northwich, and some of the Cheshire countryside is quite traditionally Tory in some areas, but they lost out. Labour last time in 2015 lost out by only 800 votes. So there's been this campaign to get young people voting, because the approval points for Jeremy Corbyn amongst under 40s, he's 57 points ahead of Theresa May, whereas if you take on board all of the generations, he is still slightly under in many polls. Right, so Chester's another one. There was a lot of votes for UKIP. Where will they go? There were several thousand, and Labour got in by, I think it was about 100 votes there. So, depending on where they're going, are they all going back to the Conservatives? But I spoke to a local candidate, and he said, well, it might actually, some of them are going back to Labour. Right, so what's your view of this election, that Theresa May has pulled just after saying it's all vital for a Brexit negotiations to have 5 more years of power when she could have had an extra 3?
Well, this is the election that no one wanted, let alone most of the Conservative Party. This has been, I think, the first election that has just been, there's plenty of firsts for it. So initially we told there won't be an election, then of course there is. Now, I might be humble bragging in a few ways, namely, I did say this time last year my thoughts that there would be an election. Now, the election was calculated on several things. Firstly, that opinion polls before the election were showing the Conservatives with 20-point double-digit leads, 22 points. But May also had other considerations than just the opinion polls. There was Tory election scandals, corruption, and all of this, which to a large extent still hasn't really gone anywhere. The other consideration is that of Brexit. She thought that she could run the election just on the topic of Brexit. Now, the Conservative Party's essentially been hijacked by the far right and the so-called UKIP wing. So she thought that this would be an opportunity to have a single-issue election, essentially another referendum, that would see her with more right-wing as opposed to far-right MPs. Now, unfortunately for her, this gamble really has backfired. I was speaking to quite a number of senior Labour Party figures on the day that the election was called, essentially to say that May has, and her strategy is quite simply to have a single-issue election. In other words, she'd conceded ground on every other point. Now, the Liberals then fell into the trap, and the trap, again, they thought that they could win or do better than their current 9 MPs by being the opponents to Brexit. So what we've seen with the election is essentially the Liberals and the Tories fighting on Brexit only, with the Labour Party and others picking up every other issues. So the other part of this, I mean, the elephant in the room is the polls. Now, a lot of people are getting very excited about, Labour's, I think, now at 3 points behind the Tories, and there's a lot of excitement, YouGov predicting a hung parliament and all of this. And I think we just need to keep some caveats in place. Firstly, the polls haven't got it right, and they've been getting it wrong pretty much from 74. The margin of errors been increasing to, I think, where we are now, which is about 8% out. The notion of a hung parliament, I think, is, well, it's unusual, because I imagine this is a rallying cry to the Tories who weren't going to vote, or indeed the huge bulk, 14 million people who didn't vote to stop this so-called coalition of chaos. Now, the problem with the polls is they aren't representative. I mean, if they take a sample of 2,000, most people who fill in opinion polls are people interested in politics of a certain age and don't often show. I think the last data tables that I was sent from YouGov, 2008 people were surveyed, and yet both male, female, below the age of 24, there was 97. So you can see that what the pollsters then do is, well, do we know if young people are going to go out and vote? Do we know that if the don't knows are going to go out and vote? Now, unfortunately, as history tells us, there's always great excitement that young people will go out and vote because neither did vote Labour. Unfortunately, experience says that often they don't. Registration does not necessarily translate into votes. Now, that might seem a bit of a surprise to some listeners, but when it comes to psephology and campaigning and strategy for Labour, I think there needs to be some reality. So yes, the polls have narrowed. We're not going to see anything like a Tory landslide where at the beginning of the campaign, there was commentary around 200 MPs being given to the Tories. That I would be stunned if that happened. But I think, and unfortunately, 60% of me is saying we're in for a bit of a nasty surprise when the exit polls are announced. And I think that nasty surprise will be that the Tories look set to have a majority of 60. But I will just give a caveat on this. The polls are out. If we had any idea that what the final figure would be, you'd be expecting most pollsters to be at least broadly in line with each other, and they're not. They're about 12 points out of each other. Now, what this means, of course, is it could be 12 points out for Labour. Don't forget, after the last election, there was an inquiry into why it is the pollsters were incorrect. They were given a list of recommendations by the British Polling Council to essentially weight their votes differently. And by weighting, all I mean is, again, assuming the don't knows, assuming that there's a better sample for, that's all what weighting essentially is. Weighting is just an admission that the pollsters don't have enough people to survey. And there's another problem here. This is the first election in which I'm unsure whether even my predictions, which have got a good track record, are going to be correct, because there isn't a national picture anymore. This is probably the first of a series of elections, coming up, that the people who are answering polls in Scotland are faced with a choice between SNP and the Tories. In Wales, it's Labour and the Tories, same with England. But in Northern Ireland, there's a different picture. Now, it's undoubtedly that we've, for this election at least, come back to a two-party state, dependent upon which country you're in. Now, when national polls go out, there isn't a real reflection of that picture. So what it is that I think is going to surprise most is the only way that we can get an accurate picture is by constituency. And this is why, whilst I'm saying in one breath, my fear is that there is a Tory majority of 60, it's very difficult to give any backing to that. So the 40% of me is saying, well, there's plenty of work going on in constituencies. In fact, tomorrow I'll publish a map of how I think each constituency will vote, to give you a prediction as to where I think the actual numbers will lie. And the other problem with this is the Tories, I mean, this is the first campaign I've ever seen a party break a manifesto pledge before they've even been elected in. And it's the first election where I've seen an obsession with strong and stable, and yet the person who's allegedly strong and stable isn't. It just seems to be taking a backseat for the entire journey. I don't think with the 7 days remaining before the vote that we're going to see anything more of Theresa May, and I think that's because she's damaged goods. Don't underestimate that the Tories at the moment are selecting a new leader. If May doesn't improve upon her majority by a significant number, then this is the end of May. The let's make June the end of May will probably resonate. Now, the best hope for Labour is essentially a gain of more than 10 seats. And I think that's infinitely possible. There's an obsession by the media not only to demonise Corbyn, which I think is, people who I see on the doorstep say two things. Firstly, Labour are the only people that have knocked. And secondly, they feel like they're watching bullying. It's like being back at school. And we can't underestimate the public and underestimate Britain for not supporting an underdog, but for wanting to support someone who is being bullied. Policies have made a huge difference. Now, the problem that we've got is the Tories are going to easily pick up some seats in Scotland. I reckon around about between 2 and 4. Labour are not going to pick up any seats in Scotland. They're also going to hoover up 3 or 4 seats from the Liberals, as will we. So I think the Liberals will end up with, at best 4 MPs, at worst 3, losing their seat up in Norfolk to bring them down to 3. Now, if there was any suggestion of how Labour wins, well, the only way that Labour can win, just looking at the maths behind it, is by working in a coalition. So we have to treat SNP votes and SNP seats as just essentially being Labour seats, or coalition seats, however you want to phrase it.
I think what's unfortunate is that obviously a lot of those were Labour seats. There were some Liberal Democrats in the Highlands and so on, but the chance of a majority has been damaged by what's happened in Scotland, which is it's great for the push for independence, but so that's something that may permanently be a problem.
Well, I'm unsure that actually. I mean, in the medium term, it's undoubtedly the case that Scotland is going to vote for independence. For the short term, well, actually, essentially, just look at it as Labour votes have swapped to the SNP. If the SNP votes magically were Labour seats, it still wouldn't rectify the problem of us being short. And by us, I mean Labour. The problem essentially is that the Liberals have collapsed in support, so there's fewer. The Tories, who would be defending traditionally against the Liberals, Labour, well, the Liberals are all but wiped out, and I can't see them surviving as a party for too much longer. I actually think they'll be replaced by Green politics, and we're actually seeing the death of Liberal politics at least for the next 50 years. The problem is, if we take what I hope happens, which is a hung parliament, or, if a miracle happens that we end up with a Labour majority somehow, but if we take the more realistic option of a hung parliament, say, short of 10 seats, it becomes impossible for any party to form a government. For example, if the Tories had 310 seats and the Liberals gain, 5, then there isn't a way for the Tories to get a majority. Then again, if Labour get 260 and the SNP get 45, for example, we would need a coalition of every other party, and it just becomes very, very unlikely. So this election is going to pose 2 problems. if we end up with a coalition of the left, there will be lots of there'll be lots of parties involved, and that could be seen as unstable. Personally, I couldn't wait. I think a coalition with the Greens, Plaid, the SNP would be a very good thing for Britain. A left slate, if you will. But the risk here can't be underestimated, which is if the Tories do get a majority, because the risks are, well, not risks, guarantees are attacks on workers' rights, NHS wholly privatised, any idea of home ownership would become irrelevant when they seize up your assets if you've got anyone to care for. Homelessness becomes an issue, and we all know the list. There is, of course, the then problem of if Labour don't do well enough, are we going to see a return to infighting? Now, hopefully, we end up in a better situation. Certainly, the direction of travel has been towards Labour. There's been some impressive performances, and I don't think we should underestimate Theresa May's absence in this actually costing her votes. But in order for Labour to win, we really need to be seeing young people not just saying we're going to vote, but actually going and voting. And of course, women. Women voters are now more likely to vote Labour than Tories. So it really is a mixed picture, and certainly a very interesting election. Nonetheless,
you're not making a direct prediction. Then you were first saying, "Oh, well, this all points to the Tories getting a small majority." Maybe that's because we can't really, the polls are usually that much out, and it still points to that. But you still say, and then the young people still can't be counted on to vote. So there has been a big push recently to tell them about voting this time. I don't know whether that's happened historically or not. Well, we might have to leave it in just a minute. We've got Nest and Ladies coverage coming up because it's the one strange time to have an interview. But that's all your thoughts there.
Well, I will leave you with my hopeful prediction, which is that the Tories are on 321 seats, Labour 250, the Liberals on 4, the SNP on 53, and UKIP wiped out. That would be my hopeful prediction.
Okay, well, so that would be something that would push for a hung parliament because you need 326 overall. It's very, very hard to govern. So, okay, well, thanks, Jay Martin, for speaking to the 107 stream. We're doing all politics all week this week, leading up to the election on June the 8th. So thanks very much. Might speak to you again soon. You never know for this.